Well, welcome to our webinar space today. We are really pleased to have our final webinar of our 2021-2022 Forest Climate Working Group Learning Exchange Series. So welcome to the space. I know everyone's starting to feel summery, and it's really nice to be wrapping up our series with our 3 sessions that are bigger deep dives on current science and emerging research that's coming out. We touched on a number of topics that we can see here in the full lineup. These have all been recorded and are available. So if there are topics here that are of interest to you, please feel free to consider them as resources. But again, we're in our last 3 of our full lineup of 9 in our series, and these are our research topics. And for those that are not familiar, the Forest Climate Working Group is a coalition of over 60, I believe 65 different organizations and institutions that include landowners, industry actors, conservationists, academia, and those active in emerging carbon markets. The group has worked together for, I believe, over 12 years now to work on advocating for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and prevention of forest loss and land use change. So again, we have the full lineup where this is the last session, so there's no more to sign up for now, but we do have these all recorded and available, including PDFs of previous slide decks and resources. So please consider them resources going forward. They're on the Forest Climate or the Forest Carbon and Climate program, our program's open resource library. So to move to our speaker today, we are delighted to introduce Dr. John Bailey. And he is a professor in the forestry department at Oregon State University. He is going to be speaking to us today on a very important topic of interest to many of us, which is wildfires and their impacts on forest carbon. So really looking forward to this very timely and important conversation today. We'll have a full presentation from Dr. Bailey, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards, where we'll have a little bit of discussion. And again, this is falling under our emerging science and information category. So very happy to have our speaker today, really excited to look at all of his emerging work and to learn a little bit from him. But before we hand it over, I wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping notes. Please use the chat or the Q&A feature to submit questions. And we do encourage you to submit questions at any point in the presentation. So if you have a clarification that you need, or you have an important comment or anything that you'd like to share, don't feel like you need to save it all to the end. We do kind of organize the comments and questions that roll in, which can be helpful sometimes if we can see there are some important clarifications that'll be needed to kick off the discussion at the end. If you are joining by phone, you can email any questions to us at forestc@msu.edu. You can also contact us if you'd like to join our email list to make sure that you're staying up to date on our news. And you can also contact us with follow-up questions or to make a contact. So next slide, please. We do have CFEs available for those that are affiliated with Society of American Foresters. So if you have registered for this session, please, if you've used your email address that's affiliated with SAF, they will automatically get informed that you've participated in here today. But if you have any questions, please reach out to us and we can make sure that we're using the correct email address. Or you can also directly contact SAF on the email on the slide. We did want to take a quick moment before we hand it over to our speakers. Speaking of continuing education, we wanted to make sure that all participants are aware that we have some professional short courses that are available through the Forest Carbon and Climate program. We have an upcoming launch date for a complete revision of our Understanding Forest Carbon Management course that's now available in English and Spanish. And this was originally launched back in 2019, so it's due for a really robust revision. It launches again in July, and we offer it 3 times a year. We've had hundreds of participants from multiple countries, over 20 countries. So it's gotten a lot of interest, and we're kind of constantly improving it, very interdisciplinary space. We'd love to have your participation if you're interested. And next slide. We are also excited to announce for the first time, we have intensive deep dives on 3 US regions currently. And this is the Pacific Northwest, the Northeast, and the Southeast. There are 4 modules that kind of provide the next step after the Understanding Forest Carbon Management course, which allows participants to understand what's happening in the forest around them, projections and trends to forest cover and risks to current or species-specific risks as well. We've partnered with NIACS on this content development, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And so it also has sections on adaptive management for each section. So I wanted to make participants aware of this additional training that we now have available. So next slide, please. Oh, I think that this is our last one, actually. So we're going to go back here to pivot to our speaker today. So Dr. Bailey, going to your presentation, please feel free to take the screen, and we're looking for your presentation on wildfire and forest carbon. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome, and what an honor to be able to share my journey with you, spanning from a student of prescribed fire and also a wildland firefighter. My name is John. I have suppressed wildfire, and that started back in 1983, climbing through research, and not all research that I have done. So I need to acknowledge the OSU pyromaniacs, my grad students and undergraduates that do fire-related research here. And prior to that, Northern Arizona University, the Ecological Restoration Institute, and a lot of information and insight over the decades has come from that work. And just a little note that in 2017 is when I really committed to doing more of these kinds of presentations and sharing more of my professional and personal journey with fire, following the Eagle Creek fire there, and the idea that the time is right for some change, in that I need to be a part of that. So today, what I'm going to cover is what I see as flaws in the forest management and fire management systems. It's misinformation. It's hesitancy to change. Some of it is pathology in terms of knowing that some of this stuff is killing us, and yet we still stick with the status quo and some old thoughts. Because the new paradigm, the new thoughts are going to be much bigger thinking, both looking to the past and fire history, fire ecology, indigenous practices, and spatial scaling as well, for thinking about landscape level fire spread. We think too often about wildfire as a singular incident, rather than how it fits into time and space. And if we can stretch our minds to do that, that's going to help us be better forest managers, land managers, and fire managers. And ultimately, it'll be a better picture for carbon. And that's why I think the carbon community can be at least part of the leadership of this new paradigm as it's emerging. And since I'm a beaver now, I'm paying homage to a beaver dam here, because I'm going to use the analogy of the fuel on the landscape being a reservoir that spills one way or another, is going to spill. In reality, though, it's a big ass reservoir that we have accumulated on our landscapes, and that represents a lot of the hazard that we currently have. But let's go quickly through some of the stories and some of the images about what has gone wrong. So this is the big story, this increase in fire that we've seen, and you can go to the NIFC databases and look at this increase. And on this chart and this scale, appropriately, you might be thinking, well, what is the big deal? But we've gone from 3 or 4 million acres per year, 1 or 2 in light years, to being pretty consistently up and over 10 million acres. And that definitely should get our attention, and it happens to span my career as well. But the larger context for it, based on fire history and stories and records and all that kind of stuff, is there was actually a lot of fire in the landscape, including, of course, the big 1910 event, and the decrease, this decreasing trend over those decades is as significant and perhaps more significant than the increase that we've seen over my career. And it has always gotten the public's attention, the wildfire and the smoke associated with it. So here's the Portland paper, the Oregonian, talking about all the smoke in the air and being completely frustrated with living with days and days of smoke, pigs, running through the street, running bacon smoke. It's all smoke. It was 1867. So this kind of phenomenon of Portland being smoked out isn't a big deal. Yes, we've had some big fires, over 1 million acres in Oregon alone in 2020, some really tragic fires. Last year we had one fire, the bootleg. That was half of that, 600,000 acres in it of itself, but those are not unprecedented, because if we go back in time, we had those kind of individual fires as well as these large acreages. And note this 1849 year, because we see that in the fire scar record. So we cut into this dry conifer. This is actually west side Oregon. So certainly ponderosa pine on the eastern 2/3 of Oregon has that multiple fires per decade, huge fire scar history, like I showed in the picture. Here's the dry conifer side, even of the western 1/3 of Oregon with Douglas-fir in there. There's a whole lot of cross-dated fire record in these forests. That's a mean fire return interval of less than a decade. And remember, these are conservative. These are just the recorded events that actually scar a tree that meets our statistical criteria. So that there may have been twice as much fire as this. The really driest pine sites over on this side of the state that had Oregon white oak, often an oak savanna that's now been invaded by Douglas-fir. Lots of fire in there every 5 years, so maybe every 2 to 3 years in reality. Even the Douglas-fir, classic Douglas-fir forest with some other conifers in there, and vine maple and sword fern and all that kind of stuff. Ton of fire. This is not fire coming in every 200, 300, 400 years, kind of a common misconception for a long time in fire ecology. Mean fire return interval of 14 years. So maybe burning, once every decade on the dry end. And how about that really wet very productive Douglas-fir forest with the western hemlock component in there? Still a bunch of fire through that period of time. A couple times a century it burned. So it is not an asbestos forest that only burned every 400 years as a stand replacing event. And in fact, when we do old growth reconstruction, age reconstructions along with the fire scars, we see the very multi-aged complex of old growth Douglas-fir with the northern spotted owl and all that kind of stuff. There were pulses of regeneration, fire happening all the time, charcoal in the soil, charcoal in the lake sediments. There was fire in these landscapes. And what we did, if you might have noticed with all those fire histories, is that spigot was completely turned off over 100 years ago with Western European settlement. And given that fire exclusion, actual suppression that results in the exclusion of fire from the larger landscape, we have developed this reservoir of fuel, this elevated hazard that we have out there. And without fire kicking up the decomposition rates, we have cool winters they're wet, but they're cool, so not a lot of decomposition. And by the time it starts warming up around this time of the year, we move into a Mediterranean style climate where it's just too dry for a lot of decomposition while it's warm. And so we accumulate a lot of fuels and a lot of surface fuels. And fire was the big decomposing agent. We've also we've cut that off, and that's allowed most of our acres to accumulate record levels of fuel, to develop structures and compositions that have never existed in 15,000 years out there. And probably more scary than this hazard accumulation acre by acre is all those acres are more connected than they have ever been. And that's what's allowing for these large high severity fires to come through. Because vegetation grows, that vegetation growth is the fuel. It is aerial and ladder fuel for that transition of surface fire to crown fire. But the big message, what really drives fire spread and even those large crown fires is the surface fuel accumulation out there. So this is bad news. This is a mistake we made, again, I was part of it. When we combine that hazard with the probability that it's going to actually burn and the values that are at stake when these fires do spread across the landscape, that's how we get to elevated risk and impacts to all the things, including our human communities, but wildlife habitat, watersheds, recreation, scenery, all the things that forests are, carbon, all those things that they are, and that they are all at the same time. They are also fuels, and they have a lot of values associated with those forests and the fuels. And when they burn in uncharacteristic ways, we don't like it. And we'll lay one more layer, number 4, on this is climate change has already resulted in warmer temperatures, longer fire seasons, less snowpack, drought stress, accelerated mortality, maybe some insect and disease things in some areas. And that is certainly part of the picture as well for why the acres are going up, the acres of large fire are going up, suppression costs are going up, the social costs, which are orders of magnitude more than suppression costs, are all going up. And all of the projections that I see is that this will just be a continued trend into the future. And so to kind of summarize that, historically, we had these kind of globular probabilities that would overlap with time in order to create undesirable wildfire. And that was a pretty small overlap in the past and historically. And as a matter of fact, the indigenous peoples in the Western United States, there wasn't enough overlap between fuels and weather probabilities that fire was proactively spread through the landscapes in order to promote the values that were wanted from the lands. Now the weather envelope has gotten bigger with the longer fire seasons. Fuels have accumulated to these record levels that I've talked about, and it's not that we value the landscape more, 15,000 years later, but there are more of us out there and more of our values being impacted by the fires. And the overlap, the space of undesirable consequences of wildfire, that's why it's gotten larger. So, it's no big secret to unravel how this is happening and how we got on this trajectory that we're on. So that's the kind of sad part of the story. The good news is that fuels treatments and planning for fuels treatments as part of our broad land management and forest management goals is something that can happen and has been proven to be effective. We've made a big push with doing that in the wildland-urban interface in the name of human community protection, combinations of mechanical treatments, thinnings, partial harvest of one type or another, chemical treatment of shrubs or in particularly invasive species, and of course, prescribed burning fire itself can be part of reducing that stand level hazard. And that's great for those acres that get treated, but it doesn't really influence landscape level fire flow until we do enough of those, about a third, starts interfering with the actual landscape level fire behavior. But that's a big task to treat a third of a landscape. We can talk about that some more maybe in the Q&A as to how to do a better job of conceptualizing that and gaining the momentum to treat the amount of the landscape that actually needs to be treated. But another piece of good news is we can even spend a couple $100 an acre, and the economic models and all show that pays for itself in terms of when these treated areas are actually challenged by wildfire. So probably not, we probably can't pay $1,000 an acre and ever feel good about that from a monetary sense, but we can feel good for those acres. But we could spend a couple $100 an acre, and that's going to pay for itself. How do we arrange that so that it fits with the topography, the roads, the trails, the watersheds, everything, the harvest units, the carbon reserve areas? We just plan that into the system and look at the spatial arrangement and how that spatial arrangement maybe varies over time and how that is nested with the values that we're interested in, the human communities, the road systems, the trail systems, the scenic systems, the water, the watersheds, all of those kinds of things. And so this recent report out of the DNR up north of me is just a good demonstration of logistically how we might put these things together. And I'll draw attention to, if we, do some treatments around the road system and all to create shaded fuel breaks, potential control lines, those kinds of things, that prescribed burning can even be, part of that. And from an implementation perspective, it's just not that difficult to do, but we have to treat those fine surface fuels and they have to be maintained over time because they grow back and that kind of stuff. And it can fit, these effective fuels treatments can fit into the much broader concepts of restoration, silviculture and resistance and resilience, climate adaptations for future droughts as we look at those parts of those climate projections, and the overall cohesive strategy that we have moving forward that we've now had in place. The original thoughts for it really came from 15, 16 years ago and was ultimately put into that document. It's a great organizational tool for looking at creating resistant and resilient landscapes, fire adapted human communities, and how the third leg of the stool, safe and effective fire suppression responses, community protection stuff, how that can be part. We can do a better job of integrating the suppression activities with the prescribed burning activities and more resilient landscapes and fire safe communities and all that kind of stuff. So if you're not familiar with the National Cohesive Strategy for Wildfire, you can definitely look that up. But an emphasis point that prescribed burning is going to be part of that. We have that because of the fuel accumulation. There's going to be some aggregation and pile burning of that in many areas, and management ignited fire in the shoulder seasons. But most of it, in my mind, is going to be done, at least over the next decade, by wildfires themselves. And so we have to think about it. Here's an example from northern Arizona of a wildfire, but an area where we had done some of this restoration of fuels treatments and prescribed burning. The wildfire was basically just a prescribed burn for us when the wildfire ultimately got to that area that had been treated. So how do we do it? That's a big lift to think about how we do a better job of being able to prescribe burn during the fire season and during wildfire events. And one of my colleagues, past student Chris Dunn, is kind of leading this effort out of the Rocky Mountain Station in Missoula now. And here's an example of the kind of thinking and working that Chris has been doing, looking at a forested landscape with a road network in it, and simplifying it into these planned operational delineation units of thousands of acres that need to be connected together to a certain extent with new potential control lines, but really working from existing roads, trail systems, river streams, lakes, topographic barriers, all of those kinds of things to lay out and manage over time as part of all of our land management objectives. The idea that somewhere in the future we may want to stop a wildfire there or launch a prescribed burning program from these lines, and we want them ready to go. And in this particular one that Chris worked on, before actually sharing it with the land managers for that area, we had 36 ignitions just in this frame in a period of days that we had about 800 ignitions. So that's the magnitude of what we're up against. In this frame, 36 ignitions, and of course, with that much demand on resources, it doesn't matter how many trucks and spotters and everything that you have out there. Some of them are going to get away from you. And so this became a wildfire that spread rapidly over the first couple days of the incident itself. And so a whole lot of red, high severity stand replacing fire. And then the weather changed, as often happens. It's too big to really contain it at that point, but most of the spread in those subsequent days when we have hundreds of firefighters around it and working through the night on many of these same potential control lines, because the incident commander comes in and sees the same road system and sees the same topographic features and all that kind of stuff. And even though they didn't have the benefit of Chris's work in this case, identified many of the same containment features. And started, as you'll see down in here, ultimately back burning from some of them once the fire spread down into this drainage, and they're worried about it coming back up, and maybe the forecast is showing that the weather's going to change a little bit. And so during the incident, we even going to do some back burning from up here at the road. But we're getting further into a wet cycle of weather that's starting to really calm this fire down. Dominantly, it's blue low severity and some yellow mixed severity kinds of conditions. But the final perimeter, 50,000 acres, however many millions of dollars, and potential injuries, and all of that kind of stuff. We really could have thought about this kind of thing much further in advance. We wouldn't have had to construct a fire line across here. This fire line up here would have been ready. Note that back burning from up here, we didn't even get any fire in some of these kinds of refugia areas that we have. All a very similar picture that emerges, but orders of magnitude more expensive and more traumatic and all that than it needed to be, than if we accepted the reality that these are not individual incidences, that these things are going to happen. They're going to fit together over time and space, and we have to do a better job managing our fuels in advance, creating these potential control lines, factoring it into all of the management that we're already doing out there. So if the plan is to return to these larger planned burning activities, some mix of wildfire and prescribed burning, yep, it's a big lift, it's a big change, and as much resistance as anything comes from the agencies themselves and all that kind of stuff. But I'm here to tell you, it's going to burn anyway. So we need to do a better job picking the conditions under which these fuels are going to burn. And if we stay with the old paradigm that we have, where we just wait for these incidents to happen, we do our best job, we spend as many millions of dollars as we can get out of the federal government and out of the states in order to suppress, we risk lives, we burn communities down, all that kind of stuff. All that does is alter the composition, in the mix of severities that are out there. It shifts it to the more we wait, the more that we procrastinate, the more that we resist this inevitability, the higher the percentage of red that is going to happen within these fire perimeters, the more communities that are going to burn, the more fatalities that we will have, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why I come to the point that now is the time that this has to change. We just have to do a better job. And so I'll finish with just what I see as the implication for carbon pools, new figure that I'm working on. I'd love feedback on it, but it's the importance, given just the inevitability of fire. It's not whether or not we have fire. Really what it is how do we want it to burn? Do we want it to burn in the low to moderate severities or the moderate to high severities? And this is the implication for some hypothetical carbon pool that we have here that's dominated by above ground living vegetation and a corresponding below ground soil component. And there's not a lot of change immediately that comes through with low severity fire. There's a little bit of carbon emission and a little bit of additional mortality that's created. But within 10 years, that fire generated dead material has now become negligible. There's still standing above ground dead out there, but the residual trees are growing. They're incorporating a certain amount of that carbon into the soil. We knocked the surface fuels down a little bit. Surface fuels are accumulating again, which asks, maybe it's time to run a prescribed fire through here again. in here. And over the long term, this is really, accumulating a lot of carbon in the above ground vegetation and the corresponding below ground. In contrast to that, high severity fire kills a lot of the above ground, shifts it immediately, doesn't, not all of it, but shifts it immediately to a lot of standing dead, and sets up a very different trajectory. And those carbon emissions from those kinds of fire events continue for many decades. It's still emitting carbon, starting to reaccumulate some of the above ground living vegetation. The soil isn't dipping, the soil carbon isn't dipping, much lower. But to look at the size, and moderate is somewhere in between the two. But look at the size of the carbon pool here that is on site and is now sequestering carbon. It's half the size of an area that has experienced a low severity fire. So not a lot of carbon change, and you see that plenty in the research and life cycle analysis on carbon. Not a lot of carbon is emitted from these actual fire events that cover the whole range of severity, but the trajectory that they're going to be on for decades and the carbon implication that they're going to have goes on for decades. And this is a big difference, something that approximates, about half of the pool. And this one is still emitting. It's half the size and still emitting carbon in a net sense. So with that, that's my fire story and what I see as the implication on these carbon pools. I see that some questions, comments are already coming in, and we certainly can collect more, and I can fill you in. Oh man, it looks like I nailed the time, Lauren, so we're good.
Yeah, this was really great. And I'm sure we're gonna, we already have some really great questions. I think we can have a nice discussion here based on this. So thank you so much for this introduction. A short history lesson is always helpful for context. And I always appreciate that. So to get into some of these questions here, starting at the more historical side of things, you mentioned like historical record of pretty large scale fires. Do you have records or understanding of how intense these fires were? And how should we think about them? We're hearing a lot about changes in intensity, stand replacing fires. Can you just unpack that a little bit more for us? Both in terms of, if there's changes in intensity and then changes in mortality rates as a result.
Of course, we don't have good pictures or records or aerial photography, satellite imagery of 400 years ago, 4,000 years ago. But as we reconstruct as we look at the fire scars, look at the age structures of the stands across these fire adapted systems, which is most of Oregon, most of the Pacific Northwest. In all, it's clear that dominantly it was low severity fire. And in some of the systems like ponderosa pine, it's carried by grass and low-lying grass and shrubs with needle drape in it and burned multiple times per decade, very uniformly. We think with Douglas-fir, it was much less uniform, much patchier. There would be more isolated torching. It's more productive, so more fuel would accumulate between those fires, and that all feeds together to have a more heterogeneous mix of fire, but still dominantly the low to mixed severity. And that's clear even without the benefit of aerial photography and satellite imagery now, where we look at it. Once we start having pictures and records and all that kind of stuff, like the 1910 fire and all, that was already being heavily impacted by 100 years of initial settlement and fire exclusion, a change in the fire frequency and how it burned. There was already scattered logging and railroads and agricultural conversions. So a big parts of the 1910 fire in addition to being a dry climatic cycle and incredible fire weather conditions, was also slash and railroads and towns and extra embers and all those kinds of things. And then we have the implementation of very proactive fire suppression activities that really started including and takes us to the lowest part of that graph. So the rebuild has been disproportionately high amounts of high severity fire, at least in the first couple days when these wildfires are being driven by wind and heat and vapor pressure deficits and those kinds of things. So we've shifted from 400 to 4,000 years ago, a fuel limited landscape with not even enough ignition opportunities that the peoples of that time purposely spread fire to meet their objectives. That's our best understanding. Now we have a fuel laden environment and fuel driven wildfires that overlap with our fire seasons and produce a very, very different intensity and corresponding severity.
So, okay, that's really helpful. And you also kind of, asserted that, we're still, the fire issue, is not, areas are still going to burn. They're still going to be fire prone. There's still fire seasons. Is a higher level takeaway then that the total area of fire maybe shouldn't change, but we're targeting with management interventions, the severity would move back to a different level of equilibrium?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to phrase it. As a matter of fact, the area, as we run the models out into the future and looking at even with mechanical treatments to get some of the fuel off the landscape, if we want to restore any semblance of the fire return interval from a fuels management perspective, but also from the ecological and social perspectives of fire, that might be 4 to 10 times as much acreage of fire. But if we choose the conditions under which we're doing it, it'll be at a lower intensity, lower severity, and can be blended with all the other land management activities that we're doing. And I can hold up, an example is always good for understanding these kinds of things. We have some very active ranger districts, very good prescribed burners around, and active thinning programs, and collaborative, community groups that are behind doing this restoration treatments, and they're doing thousands of acres per year, and they have CFLRP money and that kind of stuff to get that work done. It is the Lord's work. It is good stuff that they are doing out there. But that district might be 400,000 acres. Mm-hmm. So doing thousands of acres is just a drop in the bucket, and wildfire is burning tens and hundreds of thousands of acres, and so until we can turn this corner and get in front of this a little bit, wildfire is going to be treating those, and currently it's treating them the way it wants to treat them. We need to intervene in that phenomenon.
Yeah, so that's great, and we have a couple questions really in this direction. I did want to ask a quick clarification question before we went into some of these kind of bigger management questions. In your final graph, you showed the carbon figure that you have, mm-hmm. And you showed that the high severity fire decades into the future, that forest scenario was still losing emissions, was still losing carbon. It had still losing carbon into the future.
Yeah. And from the fire correlated to the fire itself. So that's the larger standing snags that have now fallen to logs and are decomposing and all that kind of stuff. The green stuff is coming back a little bit, but 90%, take the number, 90% of the carbon was put on the death trajectory and the decomposition and emission. And of course, we speed that up. It wouldn't last decades if we have reburning coming in, because that's going to accelerate the emissions. We can only dry in a green forest. We can only drive out probably a maximum of about 10% of the carbon with a single fire event, including days of smoldering combustion and those kinds of things. But a dead forest with lots of standing snags and logs and this accumulated rubble that's coming down in a field of shrubs and new regeneration and all that kind of stuff, the next wildfire event can burn off 50% or more of the carbon in a single event, release that carbon back to the atmosphere. And the next one after that, another 50 or 60% of it as it becomes more decomposed and more vulnerable to the next fire events.
Got it. And we also had specific to this idea of continuing to lose carbon. Do you have a sense of the effect on soil in these cases, soil carbon? Because I know that's a big topic of trying to better understand some of those dynamics. Yeah. Is that also a source of longer term losses?
Yeah, I work with the soil scientists and now work for a couple of the soil scientists that get in that have gone into administration. So, that's much more difficult work, and so we go more at estimates and little patches of work where people have really tried to probe it and look at it. But the same basic idea follows in terms of where are we sequestering above ground vegetation and therefore have living roots, underneath the ground that are also sequestering a very similar amount of carbon versus the standing dead material. And maybe it's a little bit more resilient, that carbon pool of dead carbon, old root systems, old stumps, the bases of snags and all that kind of stuff. It's a little bit more resilient when it's down in the ground, but a certain amount does burn out of the ground, particularly under these dry end of the fire season kinds of conditions where you can burn out large stump holes and fall that into knee depth down into old root canals and that kind of stuff. That's down there, but it's a more resilient pool, but the direction is all net out as it's decomposing. The net in is from living vegetation that regrows on these sites, and particularly as large carbon, woody vegetation, and particularly trees. I mean, grasses do a good job over thousands of years of incorporating organic matter, right into the surface, but there are deeper carbon pools that's woody vegetation and particularly trees.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. We did have a couple questions here to pivot to the management intervention. So you talked to some big picture thinking here, the scale of the challenge. You particularly used a metric to treat a third of the landscape. Wanted to clarify, when you speak about a third of the landscape, are you speaking specifically more towards the Pacific Northwest, or is this a national estimate, or where does this come from, and what's the scope?
Yeah, I think I'm most comfortable thinking about Western systems because those are the modelers in California, Missoula, myself, and others that have really kind of worked out the math and the model runs around that. But I also don't have any reason to suspect it would be different globally. And with students, I often use the analogy of floating down a river in your tube or your kayak or something like that. And as you're thinking about fire flow across the landscape, think about river flow down through a channel. And at what point do rocks and logs start blocking the flow of the water and create problems for you in your canoe or your tube or your kayak? And so that's why that roughly, I mean, if you strategically place some logs, you can do it with less than a third, but just kind of randomly starting to block about a third of the river, you're starting to influence the flow of water and the movement of tubers. At 2/3, kind of the upper end, you are definitely having to walk around some of that stuff. And water is definitely backing up and eddying and pooling and all that kind of stuff. So the model runs for fire, and this kind of analogy with the river clearly show that somewhere up there in the 2/3 area, if we've treated that much, we are definitely influencing landscape level fire flow. So the magic area is between the 1/3 and the 2/3 for how we can strategically place it, particularly relative to all those other things that we value: the human communities, watershed, wildlife habitats, scenic areas, trails, special botanical areas, carbon, those kinds of things.
Yeah, those are some really nice examples and imagery that you showed, actually, thinking of this is a multi-tool, there's multiple tools that can approach these challenges. So thinking of that, what are your thoughts on how that can be achieved? So you said you highlighted some examples of activities that are happening, but still a challenge and a limitation to really scale that up at the level that is probably required on a Western, particularly on the Western landscapes, where it feels very pressing to do so. What do you have thoughts about the strategies? And I have a couple questions. One could be more of the strategy from the management side of things. So like, how do we do a better job of picking conditions? And but then also there's like a funding and capacity and actually identifying the actors to do that. So maybe to start with the intervention side of things, how do we do a better job of picking the actual strategies themselves and scaling that up? And realizing there's multiple tools that can be applied here to achieve that.
Yeah, and this is part of the professional journey and personal journey. I decided I had to do a better job of getting this message out and explaining it better analogies, better information to my students as I train the next level of professionals. More truth speaking and calling out people that say, oh, we just need bigger airplanes. It's like, no, that does not have any effect. We can't throw more billions of dollars at this. I had a colleague that in addition to doing this kind of work 10 years ago, he's retired now, he was also a high school track coach for his kids. And he goes, when you're in a race against a program where your kids have been lapped and are getting lapped, and that's the analogy for this fire. We have been for years, decades now, getting beat, and we got beat last year, and we're getting beat right now as well in terms of, if you look at fuels and climate and fire seasons and resources and rules and all that kind of stuff. We cannot just yell at the kids to run faster. We have to fundamentally change this game in this race and how we view it, because we're going to get beat. We're going to get beat and continue to get beat at this race. So that's the first message and the first thing to overcome. And to overcome that pathology of suppression, that to continue, to attempt 100% suppression of every fire and see fire as evil just kicks the can down the road to make next year worse. And this is an interesting phenomena because as a firefighter, all firefighters know that area that previously burned is a potential containment line. The fuel levels are lower. It's your safety zone. It's your escape route. Other areas that had burned yesterday, areas that burned last month, areas that burned last year. You can see them out there. You can see the fuel difference. You can see how fire behaves differently in those areas. We know that when we're out on this one little incident that we're out on, we know where areas have already burned. We completely fail to see that this incident is next week's containment, next month's containment, next year's containment area, next year's safety zone, next year's escape route for the subsequent fire. So that's step 2, is getting through the pathology of we just have to put fire out. Step 3, factor it into this new perspective, into, down in the Southeast, mostly private land. And fortunately, in the Southeast United States, prescribed fire is part of the culture, and they largely do a good job. factoring it into their overall land management plans, and the ag systems versus forestry systems versus the longleaf pine reserves and all that kind of stuff. And they have a relatively fuel limited landscape down there because of that history. But that's going to be different when it's private people getting together and thinking about these issues. Out west, much broad public land. 60% of the state of Oregon is public land. So that's going to take the federal commitment to this collaborative land management, finding the resources, rebuilding a workforce for that, factoring it into all the things that we do in the name of public land management. And the part of our society that just does not like cutting trees or prescribed burning because of the risk or the smoke, we just have to keep working them along collaboratively. And when they don't want to be part of the collaborative solution, we marginalize them, just like all elements of society that are no longer on board for the greater movement forward. We just have to push them to the side. The white supremacists, the no tree cutting, the male chauvinist pig, all that kind of stuff. Just push them to the side, and we're gonna move forward.
Yeah, so that is this is an area obviously it's getting a lot of attention. There are resources coming down the line. Certainly, a lot of people looking for solutions, working really hard on finding solutions and getting that capacity. So I wanted to maybe kind of end, or actually, I'm sorry, I did have one more question. Speaking of the tree cutting topic, could you also speak to the role of productive forests, so commercial logging, and obviously there's industrial level activities. I know the situation on the East Coast can be challenging in some ways because there's a lot of private landowners that maybe aren't managing their land. So there are concerns on the East Coast, like in New Jersey, for example, of fuel loads, and there is really no industrial activity. It's all private landowners. And so there's a different kind of challenge there. There's an absence of some of those activities. But I thought maybe if you could speak to the impacts of commercial logging on the current fuel situation, but also in sometimes moving trees to being younger and removing also large and fire resistant trees from the landscape. And that can also result in denser, more flammable vegetation. So how do you see that kind of playing out on the landscape and affecting resilience, or how should we think about the balance of those changes that have happened in the past and what we have on the landscape now?
Yeah, I think on public lands, that's pretty clear that the idea is to protect the larger fire resistant and resilient ecosystems that are out there for the wildlife habitat value, or just public opinion, scenery, whatever the list is. I don't see a return to clear cutting on public lands, in the name of fuels reduction. We do have 15-20% of the Oregon landscape is industrial owners that have shareholders. You might own some stock in your 401k in some of these companies. They're fixing a lot of carbon. It's being stored in other pools, but it's part of the rotational harvest and life cycle analysis that we can do on wood. They're not going to be interested in prescribed fire other than part of their site preparation, program to make the site, more easy to plant and to maybe enhance the envelope through which their plantation grows in a low hazard, low risk kind of condition. So, they'll, with their land management objectives and that ownership is going to do a certain thing, but can be part of the collaborative planning about how we're going to get the fuel levels down. Yes, those are going to be younger forest. It's never going to store as much, particularly with a long-lived species like Douglas-fir. It's never going to store as much carbon on the hillside, but that wood's going to be stored for a lengthy period of time as some product that needs to be accounted for in a life cycle analysis, kind of program. And even when we have larger, older trees, on the hillsides storing carbon, they also are part of a dynamic that involves reburning and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to cover the whole spectrum of landowner objectives and mix of small trees and large trees and different management approaches. I see a strong history of multi-age management on federal lands in ponderosa pine, dry conifer, Douglas-fir ecosystems and all that kind of stuff that in the end will store a lot more carbon on the hillsides than are currently on public land as these trees, as these forests, as these individual trees and as these forests develop structure and age and do a better job of surviving an uncertain future in terms of drought and wildfire itself revisiting these stands. We're losing a lot of wildlife habitat, watershed conditions, recreational opportunities to high severity wildfire currently. And that's the big concern. And we're losing a lot of carbon pool. So, if we do a better job, we'll ultimately be storing more carbon out there than our current trajectory will do.
So that was really helpful. And I think there's certainly more in this discussion, as this is definitely like an active area, looking at solutions and understanding risk in different areas, what that looks like. There's areas that I know consider themselves very low risk in states, like maybe the state that I'm in has large areas that are considered low risk, but that may not be the case in the future. So thinking about identifying some of those, maybe I know that's an emerging solution that could be something to unpack in the future, is identifying the areas that are low risk and continue to be low risk for potential longer term carbon storage and identifying other areas that need different types of intervention. So definitely an active area to keep an eye on and to think about what are the trade-offs in different positions. And you gave us a lot to think about today. I wanted to just kind of wrap up here, just kind of what's a big thing we should be thinking about? You've touched on a lot of things, gave us a lot of details, but just kind of to end, kind of closing thoughts between fire and climate. What should we be looking at, maybe at the national level, where we take into account, we do have different levels of risk, but what should we be looking at and thinking about? What's the takeaway, maybe for other actors that aren't pressed as hard as out west to think about these topics, but maybe should be. So what do you think we should all be kind of thinking about?
I would say is, the old bumper sticker, act locally, but think globally. This is a global issue. So even if you're in Michigan, there should be some interest in what's going on throughout the West, because forests and forest management will have a role in climate solutions, at least in the broad, massive temperate region of the planet. It has great potential. I know I played the role of Dr. Doom to a certain extent there, those first 10 minutes or so for this trajectory that we're on and what we have forgotten. But we're learning. We can change this. There are tools, and unlike hurricanes or sea level rise, where we just kind of have to adapt to it. This is one where we can get out in front of it, actually ease some of the pressure. And wood is great stuff. And every time we can substitute wood for concrete or steel or plastic or other things that are killing us, every time we can grow a tree and substitute wood for that, it's a net improvement to the planet.
So this was, again, a great session. I really appreciate the insight on your work. I think we'll be having continued follow-up conversations. Really appreciate the time that you put into preparing the conversation, preparing for the presentation and having this conversation with us. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Go Bees.
Yeah, and so thank you to everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate the time. Again, thank you to all of the speakers in the lineup for this entire season. We really appreciate everyone, the time that they've put in. Again, all the recordings are available. This one will be up in about a week. And thank you. I hope everyone has a great summer and stay safe and healthy. And we'll see you all soon. Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.